Hello, my name is Derek Brecken. I'm joined today by Assistant Director of Met Media, Ronan O'Shea. Thank you for being here.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So we're working through my final project for critical thinking in 21st century media. Hopefully we achieve some critical thinking here in this project today. My topic is Twitter and the American political process, and specifically how Twitter is impacting that process. So the thesis statement is the dramatic rise in popularity of Twitter and its increasing importance in the American political discourse, combined with American public's distrust of traditional media and Twitter's inability to moderate the spread of disinformation at scale, has created a new threat to the American political process. So kind of how we're going to run this discussion is we'll walk through each part of that thesis and then talk a little bit about the evidence that I've collected. So let's start first with the dramatic rise in the popularity of Twitter. The first infographic that we'll look at here is basically the number of monthly active users on Twitter in the United States from the first quarter in 2010 to the first quarter in 2019. And so as you can see on this chart here, we're looking at about 10 million people in quarter one, 2010. And then that number jumps up to just under 70 million in quarter one of 2019. So Twitter boasts 350 million users across their platform, but this is just the monthly active Twitter users. That's a pretty dramatic rise.
It is a pretty dramatic rise. And I remember I was a senior in college, 2008, 2009, when Twitter was really ramping up for the first time. And I was in broadcasting. I saw the value in it. To see what has happened over the next decade is unbelievable. It has infiltrated every aspect of entertainment, news, politics, sports, you name it, all across the world now. And it absolutely is a huge driving force in the conversation that people have with each other.
So the next bold point here that we have is its increasing importance in the American political discourse. And then the first piece of evidence that we've got here is Seizing the Moment, the Presidential Campaign's Use of Twitter During the 2012 Electoral Cycle by Daniel Kreis. And what I found interesting in this article was something he calls performative power. So in any presidential election, candidates are trying to generate publicity. They're trying to reach their audience through whatever medium is most effective. And traditionally that's been television, right? And so this is looking at specifically President Obama's 2012 electoral campaign and how he was able to reach his base through Twitter. And I just want to read one of the quotes here. Perhaps the most telling way to see performative power at work comes in relation to two things that campaigns value most: money and favorable press coverage. I think that one thing that Obama did really well was gather a lot of small donations throughout the country through his social media presence. And Twitter was a huge part of that campaign that he put together. And in this case, I think people would consider this as a positive thing, but this is kind of the first part of the discussion on how Twitter is impacting our political process. It's a new avenue for presidential candidates to reach their base.
Yeah, and I don't think on the surface level there's anything wrong with that. The way that you communicate has evolved with time. Initially print, whether it was newspaper, magazine style. Radio obviously popped up in the 20s, and then TV 20 years or so later. Internet and social media being the natural evolution of the internet and having that be available to everybody. I don't think that on that front there's anything wrong with it. And if you are, whether you're a presidential candidate or an organization, controlling your message, getting it directly in the hands of the people who determine whether or not you're going to have power is very, very important and very critical. It's just a decade of this now. We've seen how it's sort of fallen apart a little bit too, but I know we'll get into that.
The next bolded topic is America's distrust of traditional public media. And so I'll just read a quote here from Gallup poll. 62% of Americans believe news is biased, and 44% say it's inaccurate. And so this is Americans who have distrust in newspapers, television, and radio. And so as President Trump has kind of attacked the media and you know, the fake news term has been thrown around a lot, there has been some blending of the pundit and the journalist. And so there is a little bit more opinion in the news. Americans are just less likely to trust it.
Yeah.
And I think that is pushing them towards alternatives like social media.
And I also think a good chunk of the blame is on these journalism or media outlets. They have absolutely brought this on themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't even just mean the slant one way or the other, but even like newspapers. What we've seen happen to newspapers over the last 20 years is almost 100% on newspapers, complete failure to adapt when things were changing around them. And even now today, I was in class yesterday showing students something from the Denver Post. We had one heck of a time even trying to bring up the Denver Post website, pop-up ads. I pay for a subscription. I have an online membership, and I'm still getting slapped in the face with things like pop-up ads and a bad user experience. But go to CNN.com today, and it's unbelievable. Every headline is, "You won't believe what this politician said."
Right.
It's just clickbait. And for someone like me, it's a huge, huge turnoff from what maybe when I was growing up was a traditional trusted media source. I go to CNN.com today, and it's all, President Trump said what? Click here. Anderson Cooper's reaction was this.
Right.
I don't click on any of it then, and because it's not news. Media at some point here in the last 100 years in particular, especially news, when it became for profit, it changed everything.
Yeah.
And including the way that I think the American audience accepts news and journalism, because it isn't all about we need to tell the important stories, we need ratings, we need to sell newspapers, we need to sell magazines, and that absolutely affects the integrity, I think, of what they're putting out.
Part of the distrust in the media comes from the platform's inability to stop the spread of disinformation. And specifically, in this thesis, we're talking about Twitter's inability to moderate the spread of disinformation at scale. So it's one thing to moderate a forum, where there's maybe 100 people participating, but when you've got 300 million users across the platform, and maybe 50 million of those users are fake accounts or bot accounts, it starts to get more difficult. So we're going to take a look at this clip. This is Joe Rogan's podcast, and he is kind of hosting a little back and forth between an independent journalist named Tim Pool and the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and the head of safety and security, Vijay. I can't pronounce her last name. But so they're talking about moderating content at scale in this clip and whether or not it's possible.
So we can agree with you when you say these things like, Alex said this, it sounds like a threat. He was berating this person, saying awful things. But ultimately, your judgment is the context. You say we have to pay attention to the context. We're just trusting that you made the right decision.
Well, I'm giving you as much facts as I can give you here. And I think that this is the real hard part of content moderation at scale on global platforms. It's not easy, and I don't think Jack or I would tell you that it's easy.
It's a preposterous volume you guys have to deal with. And that's one of the things that I wanted to get into with Jack when I first had him on, because when my thought, and I wasn't as concerned about the censorship as many people were, my main concern was, what is it like to start this thing that's kind of for fun, and then all of a sudden it becomes the premier platform for free speech on the planet Earth?
So
It is that, but it's also a platform that's used to abuse and harass a lot of people, and used in ways that none of us want it to be used, but nonetheless it happens. And I think it's an enormously complicated challenge for any company to do content moderation at scale, and that's something that we are sitting down thinking about. How do we take this forward into the future?
Scale.
Because
it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can hear at the end there, Jack says it doesn't scale. So he's basically admitting that there's no way for them to moderate content at that level. And earlier in the episode, they kind of talked about the staff that they have allocated to just handle anything that's happening at Twitter. And it's like 4,000 people.
Very small company in the grand scheme of things.
Right. And he said, I think only about 1,000 of those people are focused on content moderation or user experience. And so basically what we're talking about is the new public square, the new place for politicians to campaign, the new place for citizens to interact and engage with their elected officials. It is shifting onto these digital platforms that really are too big for anybody to step in and moderate fake news or harassment or targeted campaigns to silence certain individuals. And that raises a lot of interesting questions just from the standpoint that this is the new public square. But what we'll get into next is kind of a little bit more about like what these bots are and where they're coming from. And when you start to piece together that it's not just people in America that are maybe trying to silence somebody on the other side of the political aisle, but it's somebody from another country, funded by a State Department, who is trying to sow dissemination with the goal to disrupt the American political process. Let's talk a little bit about the bots and sort of how fake accounts are created with the purpose of influencing our election. So another guest on Joe Rogan's podcast who specifically touched on this was Renee DiResta, and she was a member of the committee who put together the presentation that sort of brought Congress in on what's going on here. So this is an article published, The Bots That Are Changing Politics, and this is from motherboard.com, which is an offshoot of Vice. So I'll read a little bit from this second paragraph here. Scholars have argued that nearly 50 million accounts on Twitter are actually automatically run by bot software. On Facebook, social bot accounts run by automated software that mimic real users or work to communicate particular information streams can be used to automate group pages and spread political advertisements. Recent public revelations from Facebook reveal that Russian Troll Farm, which has close ties to the Kremlin, spent around $100,000 on ads ahead of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. And produced thousands of organic posts that spread across Facebook and Instagram. The same firm, the Internet Research Agency, has been known to make widespread use of bots in its attempts to manipulate public opinion over social media. So there you have it. There's a new avenue for foreign entities to impact our democratic process.
And it's nothing new to have foreign agents, particularly places like Russia, trying to influence our elections. That goes back to the beginning of our country. It's just this digital realm of doing it that is unique. I mean, they evolve as we do with the times.
This is the presentation that Renee DiResta and a group of other people presented in front of Congress regarding the specifics of the Internet Research Agency and their attempts to influence our democratic process. And so I wanted to read just a couple of the key points that they were focusing on in this investigation. So the first is that there's attempts to hack online voting systems. Second is that a cyber attack targeting the Democratic National Committee executed by the GRU, which led to a controlled leak via WikiLeaks of email data related to the Clinton presidential campaign. And then third is a sweeping and sustained social influence operation consisting of various coordinated disinformation tactics aimed directly at U.S. citizens designed to exert political influence and exacerbate the social division in the U.S. culture. So those are all things that the Internet Research Agency was tasked with doing leading up to the 2016 presidential election. And these things largely, so the third is what we've been talking most about, is the impact through social campaigns. But we can't forget, that the whole locker up and, private email server stuff came from Russian influenced WikiLeaks. And so again, it's nothing new that foreign entities are trying to influence our election. It's just that there's new ways to do it as the technology evolves.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting, too, the online voting systems. I was thinking about that yesterday. I was a little bit inconvenienced trying to vote in Denver yesterday, trying to drop off my ballot. And I was thinking as I was walking back to the car, gosh, this would be so much easier if I could just log in, put my username and password. But this is obviously at the forefront, too. And it's something that they haven't quite figured out how to actually pull it off yet, although you would think if people could just vote from home, it would increase turnout.
Right. A couple more things from Renee DiResta, and this is actually from the address that she gave to Congress. You can find this on C-SPAN. Foreign Influences on Social Media is the title. But I wanted to read a couple of the key points from her address there. She starts by saying, we're in the midst of an arms race in which responsibility for integrity of public discourse is largely in the hands of private social platforms, and determined adversaries find new ways to mitigate features and circumvent security measures. Computational propaganda and disinformation is not about arbitrating truths, nor is the question of free speech. She kind of ends this section of the address by saying that we believe private platforms must be held accountable. So she's talking about Twitter and Facebook. She feels like they have the responsibility to prevent or at least make clear when it's happening. But as we've talked about earlier, there's no way to do that when you're talking about billions of users on Facebook or hundreds of millions of users on Twitter. And the other thing that she suggests here at the end is that it's going to require some education on the part of the American public to become aware of this as well. We can't just have we can't have Facebook and Twitter be the only ones accountable here. But up until this address, there was no congressional insight or oversight on this part of our American political process. And so I think it's the start of a really interesting journey, I guess you could say. And, with the next election coming up here, I think there's going to be a lot more eyes on these social platforms and the messaging that is transmitted across them. And to a certain degree, how they handle that, I think, will impact their success in this country. Do you think that that's accurate, or do you feel like it won't matter? Because like we said with Twitter, there's a huge chunk of their base is not even in the United States.
Yeah.
And what if they just decide, hey, we're going to leave Silicon Valley and we'll go set up in Kuwait or Dubai?
I mean, it's not. I'll say this: it's not going to go away anytime soon. Yeah. And one of the things that I'm interested in as well is how much further is this going to go? In the last 15, 20 years, with cell phones, smartphones, and all that, we've got a whole bunch of information at our fingertips in our pockets that we carry around with us all day. We're on the cusp of AR and VR being a much bigger part of our everyday life as Americans. So how much further is this going to go when your Twitter feed is not just something that you pick up and can put down, but it's maybe something that's in your glasses, or it's part of what we see and experience every single day? It's going to blur those lines even further. So there is absolutely an obligation for these social entities to try to weed out the things that are purposely malicious. But like you said, a couple 100 million tweets per day, it's nearly impossible to isolate those things and to pull it off.
I think as we're kind of wrapping up here talking about potential solutions, things like factcheck.org and those apps that are flagging fake news are certainly going to become more popular for people who are interested in staying informed and interested in avoiding fake news. But also I think that there's a new generation of people who are growing up with this technology, and I think that those are a big percentage of the people who are showing up as distrustful of media, even across these newer platforms. And I think that level of cynicism or distrust is going to, at some point, kind of shift into more of a critical evaluation of information. And I think that people are going to continue to get better at finding good sources of information and trustworthy sources of information. Now, there's always going to be people who are uninformed, and there's always going to be those people are always susceptible to manipulation and, foreign interests and whatnot. But I think we're just entering into a new age where people have more tools, not less, to access information. And we're just in a little bit of a rocky period transitioning into that.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And when you look at the next generation, Generation Z, that are growing up now, they're growing up not interested in Facebook, being distrustful of it, even seeing it as something that, this is something my parents do. I don't want to be a part of that, which is not uncommon for a younger generation to look up at older generations and go, I want to distance myself from what they got going on. We're going to get it right. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I do think that collectively, even with all the headaches that have popped up over the last decade or so with this, people in general are in better shape today than ever before because of the access to information. But there's a rocky transition period. None of this stuff is going to change overnight, but giving more information to more human beings is going to be a better thing for our species than not.
Right.
And we live at a very interesting time, particularly our age group, where I grew up with the internet. And to see how it has exploded and changed over the last 15 years, I never saw that coming.
Right.
And what's it going to mean for the generation after us and the one after that?
Yeah.
So interesting stuff to talk and think about. And I wish more Americans thought about this too. There's a lot of us on Twitter, and they follow their people. A lot of people think that the account, that Twitter isn't aggressive enough in even banning accounts or silencing people. That's certainly a narrative that we hear a lot of now. But what's this going to look like in another 5 or 10 years?
Well, I'm glad that we took part in participating in our version of this conversation here today, and hopefully this translates into a final project worthy of 21st century critical thinking.
Well, it's a very, very interesting topic, and it's a very important topic, so I think you got that part down.
All right, thanks, Ronan.